gives you some great statistics and information about the benefits that having music and art education in our schools benefits. And for the lack of a better term, I'm going to refer to them collectively as art. Is that okay? For example, in there, one of the things that just really surprised me, students, a study that showed that if students in the early elementary schools have a music education as part of their regular curriculum, in a one-year time, we're averaging 2 to 3 points higher on IQ. And if you know anything about IQ scales and system, that's amazing that kind of increase just as a result of regular music education. And all of the benefits that come from the arts. And tonight we could spend a lot of time talking about that. But really, I think we need to educate ourselves. As you may have seen, those of you that are on Facebook, there have been some emails flying around and on No Pickens from the superintendent and so forth. And one of the things that he very clearly commented very early on to me was a very direct comment saying there's no way you can understand the budget process. And to be very candid with you, I think we can understand the budget process. And I think it's important that we as citizens and taxpayers learn a little bit about how budgeting works for school systems. It's not exciting to talk about, but it definitely drives the educational factory that is our school system. So I want to spend some time kind of going through really an overview of what we should start seeing when we walk across the street for the board meeting tonight. At least if there's not a lot of attempts to hide or talk in language that people don't understand. And that often happens. We get in a profession and we start talking in acronyms and we start talking in our language that may be confusing to people that aren't in that industry. If I started talking about, espousing poorly pronounced Latin phrases from legal ideologies, that would shock you and make it unable for you to communicate and understand what I'm talking about. And I would say very clearly, the role of the administration of the school system is not to be condescending to taxpayers and citizens. It should be about educating them about the system. And so let's start talking about some general background about arts education. First of all, clearly, music and art education are required core curriculum items of the curriculum at every level of education. Georgia is at the forefront, actually, of establishing a new national curriculum for education. And it requires, at all grade levels, there to be specific education, and at different levels, education for arts and music. What does that mean? Well, in reality, that means that our school board, as it develops programs and budgeting, has no choice but to include art and music education. There's no choice but to do it. They're mandated to do that. Music and art are state funded. And I think that's an important issue because that's already arisen if you read the Pickens County Progress article where they talked about which programs may be on the chopping block. One of the things to be considered is whether or not they are state funded. And particularly in grades 1 through 8, they are specifically funded by the state for art, music, together with PE. And we'll go through that in detail in a minute. But they are definitely state-funded educational programs. Finally, I want to be very candid with you. We're fussing about arts in Pickens County schools. Very honestly, right now, our system is above and beyond normal in providing support and education for the arts. We do more than a lot of other systems. In fact, we do more than most other state systems do. And we're going to see some examples of that. And a lot of that is locally funded. And that's a poorly phrased sentence up there when you have currently and locally together, but the point is there is a lot of funding that our school board traditionally for the last decade has started providing to help art and music education in our system. And a lot of that is locally funded as opposed to state or federal funding. And so I have to be very honest. What we're fighting for is to preserve the current level of arts education in Pickens County, which we know is above the average. Is that a bad thing? Is it bad to expect quality education opportunities for our students? And so that's kind of the premise of where we start. And I hate to bore you with information on state funding, but it's vital that you have a conversation. If you're going to walk up to Wendy and talk to her as chairman of the school board, she's going to be a lot more impressed if you understand things like what QBE stands for and means. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how the state funds education. In Pickens County, for example, about 33% of all of the funding for Pickens County school system comes from the state. 56% comes from local revenue raised by property taxes. We're a little odd because that is not normal in the state of Georgia. We have a lot more tax raised locally than a lot of other systems do in proportion to the size system we have. But state funding is kind of the driving force for how administrators in education tend to set budgets up based on a program started in 1986 called Quality Basic Education. It is how the state figures out how they're going to fund school systems. And it's been massaged constantly through the legislature. And footnote, how do I know what I'm talking about? And I think that's important that you need to know. First of all, I spent 11 years actually running the Georgia Student Finance Commission, which is a state agency most commonly known as the Hope Board, running the Hope Scholarship from its infancy through and including Sonny Perdue's administration. And so I've got a little bit of experience with running state budgets and educational budgets, particularly in the state. In addition to that, the last few days, especially since the superintendent waved the red flag in front of the bull, I've honestly spent a little time researching this. Had a long conversation with David Ralston, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Rick Jasper, our local representative. They put me in contact with representatives at the Georgia Department of Education. And at the end, I have the sources to explain where every bit of what I'm presenting came from. And so I don't purport to be an expert in funding. I'm not someone that's done it for 30 years. But I think this helps us all get a good feel for where they're coming from and saying we got to make some cuts. So when we start talking about art and music education, this is the formula used for grades 1 through 8. The state funds, meaning they pay enough money to the Pickens County school system, they pay enough money to fund one teacher in a special, they call a specialty teacher, for every 324 students. There is no funding for art or music or physical education, and we'll explain in a second why that's important, for kindergarten. Nor is there separate funding for it at the high school level. It is included in the general funding for those programs. It is not spelled out, but QBE, as it's called, does specifically provide funding for music, art, and physical education in what they call specialty teachers to teach in those three programs in grades 1 through 8. Now, it's up to the school system to figure out how they apply that state funding. Whether they hire one PE teacher, that's their prerogative. If all they want to have in their school is PE, that's the prerogative of the school system. If it's a school of 324, they may have 3 part-time teachers, one that does PE, one art, one music. That's the prerogative. So it's up to our school board, who has a lot of discretion in setting that from the funding that we get from the state. High school art, music, and PE are again included in the general bracket for education. And that general funding for education comes at a lot of different levels. Under the current QBE standard, the state again pays for the funding of a teacher at different levels. For example, kindergarten, for one for every 15 kindergarten students, they fund. Marcia's frowning, and I can tell you why. Marcia, did you teach kindergarten?
I taught kindergarten.
Did you have a class of only 15? No. And so you start to see what the game school systems play.
But does that include, would they allow more if they have a parapro? Is that how they...
I did not include in this, but there is separate funding for parapros at the elementary school level and at the special education level. For the purpose of this presentation, I did not talk about parapro funding, which is a separate item. I basically focused on teachers. And so what happens is the school system gets the money from the state, but they may elect to have larger class size and use that money elsewhere in the school system, whether that's for art and music dedicated teachers at the schools, whether that's having an extra high-paid truancy officer, which is one of the highest paid at an assistant superintendent scale level in our system, a truancy officer, which is not funded at all, but yet is paid $72,000+ a year to be a truancy officer. That's an election the Pickens County School Board made, and the funding that they get from local, they have total control over it, or from the state, they may make elections to class sizes. Because you know these aren't the class sizes that exist in Pickens County schools. This is what they get funding from the state at, though. And so I don't, this is very complex to understand. So, why doesn't, don't get the impression that you can walk over and say, well, my child is in 4th grade. Why are they in a class of 30? They should only be in a class of 23. Because the board does have the authority to make those adjustments, especially if they have supplemental teachers. In our elementary schools, we have, what are they called? Learning...
LSS.
Learning support
specialists.
And those are, again, not funded by the state, and those are elected to be funded otherwise. And much of that was in a response to the No Child Left Behind program, that those positions were created. And so the school board has to take the money it gets and divide it up to meet several objectives. Any questions on that regular funding? Okay. So let's look at what Pickens County actually does for teachers in our 3 critical fields that we know about. And I say 3 critical because, again, the state lumps PE in the equation also. The state specifically funds for in K through 5, actually 1 through 5, because they provide no art, music, or PE education for kindergarten. But most of our kindergartens still provide art, music, and PE for kindergartens, students that are in those schools. But the state funds for 4.5 people, 4.5 teachers. Countywide. And you can see these are the actual numbers today of what teachers there are teaching music, art, and physical education in our 4 elementary schools. And so clearly, if the argument is being made about state funding, well, we're going to make cuts because we're overspending because we've got all these extra teachers that aren't being specifically funded by the state, that's a valid argument. Because again, the state is paying for 4.5, and you can see just at the elementary level, and you can see how many are actually teaching in those fields. And so really, we should have almost 7 across the system, and you see the totals add up to much, much more. Where does the funding for those extra people come? Well, let me clarify. It's not that the state funding says there's going to be a PE teacher. The state funding comes and how the school allocates it. So it's not fair to say the music teacher is not state funded. Yes, that's what the law says, they are state funded. The school locally, 56% of its income is from local revenue. And that is what pays and supplements so that you have 6 PE teachers at the high school. Now, clarification. I'm not here slamming on the fact that we have 6 PE teachers. This is not sports versus arts. That's not our intent. And in fact, if anything, our intent is the more classroom education is critical regardless of where it is. And then hopefully by the end you'll see where there are places to cut and preserve all classroom education opportunities. And so that's explaining how they legitimately will argue that they locally are funding a lot of extra art and music. Yes, they are. Is that a bad thing? No. So, let's start looking, if you want to use this argument that we should only be funding, only have the people employed that the state is in fact funding, let's apply that argument to the administration. Okay. Because again, what I may not have explained is quality basic education is a funding of all aspects of the education. With the exception of federal funds that come for things like the food program and transportation, it covers everything from down to the state paying the salary for the superintendent, and down to secretaries and how many secretaries there should be in the system. And so when we start looking at where there may be a little bit of bloating beyond what the state pays for, I think on the administrative side you quickly see that that's applicable. And in candor to Mr. Desper, he did in fact say one thing that was targeted potentially was assistant principals. We have 10 assistant principals in the system, but only 7, if you round up, only 7 are paid for by the state. That means 3 assistant principals, which honestly are high salaried individuals, are paid for out of local money. Then you get into a lot of strange things in the central office. For example, accounting and personnel, the state pays for 1. We have 7, including our financial director, which is paid at the same level as an assistant superintendent's pay scale. And so I can tell you also, if you go on to the personnel clerk, the bookkeepers, etc., all of them are paid much higher than the average salary for a teacher in Pickens County, despite some of them, like Amy, having no educational experience or certification. But yet they're paid at assistant superintendent levels. It's kind of like DeKalb County that just hired a lawyer to be their school superintendent, who happened to have been the former director of the Department of Labor. But the bottom line is, apparently you don't have to have an educational background to be an assistant superintendent in DeKalb County or in Pickens County. Another example, special ed. Special education is funded very extensively by the state. They fund for central administration they fund for 3. We have 5. I talked about the attendance officer. That's her title, which is really a truancy officer. It is not funded at all by the state. That is not a common position, the truancy officer. But she is paid at an assistant superintendent's level for being a truancy officer, which is interesting given the fact that at the elementary school level, the most critical area, on attendance, we are way below the state average. But yet we're paying somebody to be the truancy officer at an assistant superintendent level. Interesting. Director of operations, who is Rick Little, by the way, paid at an assistant superintendent level to be a director of operations. That is not a common position, because in Pickens County, a director of operations is management position, and then we have a director of each of the departments he is over. We have transportation, food, director, etc. So it's almost like we have an assistant superintendent, and then we have 3 other assistant superintendents that are under him. Are we top heavy? I think this chart pretty well defines that we are. Parent involvement officer, that's not a state-funded position. Curriculum, not funded by the state, but yet we have 1.5 people at the central office that are doing that. Tech specialty. This is an area that really aggravates me about how it's funded. The state expects there to be a technology person in the classroom helping students learn technology. That's why they fund for 4. Does Pickens County have certified educators teaching technology in the schools? No. The, quote, high-paid people from the state level sit at the central office as tech support. And parapros are put in the classroom teaching technology. That's an interesting scenario. Again, not consistent with what state funding expects. Finally, secretariat. The state funds a secretary basically for every school and a couple more at the central office. Yet our school system has, instead of 10, our school system has 29 secretaries. Now, secretaries are not obviously high paid in compared to, you take the attendance officer's pay would pay for about 6 of those secretaries. But the bottom line is you can start seeing how the administrative questions are skewed by our system. Now, I want to be fair to our school system because we are all facing a unique situation created largely by the economy that's affected everybody. If there's anybody in the room that hasn't been affected since 2008 by the economy downturn, stand up. I want to meet you. I want to figure out what you did. But the state has been facing a reduction in the amount of funding they have, and they have passed it on to local school systems. So the state, and how much of that is a cut? Well, it's a pretty significant cut. From 2008 funding levels to 2012, the state reduced almost $2 billion in funding to Pickens, to not just Pickens, but all statewide school systems. And so the truth is, our school system is getting squeezed from the state. A lot of other school systems have had a different scenario because they've also been facing some squeezing from the tax revenue side. Because tax digests have gone down in most counties, there has been less local funding at the same millage rate. That has not happened in Pickens County. You may like or hate or love Roy Dobbs, but the Pickens County Board of Assessors, if nothing else, has artificially kept property values high. Hence, tax millage rates have not had to be increased as a result of the dropping of the value of the digest. Our friends to the north in Gilmer County had significant reduction in the property digest value. That's the value of all the land that your house is assessed at. They've had it drop. And so they've had funding problems a lot sooner than we have in Pickens County. And so the truth of us having kept assessment values fairly high in Pickens County has been that the school board hasn't had to raise the millage rate on homes to keep the same or higher level of income coming in from property taxes, which accounts for 56% of the county's school board budget. So, in fairness, they are getting some decrease, largely from the state funding, and that's forcing the cuts that the school board is facing. And so, let's talk about the expenses. What are we going to do to make sure that we get on with cuts that are appropriate? Well, let's look at where we spend our money for a second. And the first area that is of the Pickens County budget is we spend 57% of every dollar the school system gets, 57 cents of that dollar is spent on instructors, teachers, classroom instructors. Now that instructor term is very broad. If you have a football coach that teaches a couple of classes and the rest of the day is a football coach, he's an instructor. If you have those resource officers at the school, resource teachers, they are considered instruction, even though they may not be in the classroom. But 57% of the money goes to instructors. 9% goes to debt service in Pickens County. We're a little above the state average on debt, but there's not a lot we can do about it. The high school that Rick Little supervised in building and constructing, and we had to rebuild again with the additions recently, all have to pay on debt. And the debt is 9% of our budget every year to go to pay on those bonds that largely paid for the high school and some additional improvements. Also paid for Harmony and paid for Hill City and part of Harmony. Possibly all of Harmony. Don't hold me to that. Definitely paid for Hill City. That's 9% of the budget, and we have no way, they have no way to control or alter that. Those are past agreements that have been already committed to. So now we start talking about other discretionary spending. If you listen to the United States Congress, there's 8% that is spent in administrative expenses. That's your central office and your administration in the schools, the principals and assistant principals. Doesn't include counselors. They're considered part of instruction. 8% for maintenance. 6% for transportation. The other items are fairly small of food, support services, and media. Media being what we used to call libraries. And so if you look at where it is, and if you go make an assumption for a second, for the rest of this discussion we're going to make an assumption, that we're going to set priority number one for our school system is classroom instruction. So we're not going to make cuts to the 57%. Because what happens for our students in the classroom is first. Well, if you take and make that assumption, which is not Mr. Desper's presumption, his expressed presumption was that he was going to leave this number absolutely right where it was, as far as administration. He didn't talk anything about transportation. He was actually talking about making cuts over here. I'm advocating maybe we should talk about making cuts right here before we get into arts, music, PE, driver's ed, any other educational opportunity. We should talk about these items. And so, from the expense standpoint, where do we cut? Well, I want you to raise your hand if you think that most state school systems in the state of Georgia are efficient. Do you think they're efficient? Is there anybody in here that thinks they're very efficient? Well, I want to share with you where our system doesn't match the efficiency of the state average of systems. And guess where? Transportation, maintenance, and administration. We are at transportation. You know, Pickens County is one of the smallest geographic counties in the state. Add to that fact that we have several planned communities where the buses only come to the gate. And so the question would be, why in the world would we be spending significantly more on transportation for a small county than the state average? There's something wrong in the transportation dollars. And we're talking about millions of dollars spent on transportation in Pickens County. Something's wrong. maybe having both a operations manager and a transportation director, maybe that's part of the problem. But bottom line is there's significant problem in transportation because we're spending more in Pickens County than the average across the rest of the state. Maintenance, same way. Now, maintenance, we actually, compared to the state as a whole, we have fairly new buildings in comparison to the state. That's part of why we're paying that 9% debt, is because we have, with the exception of Jasper Elementary and Tate Elementary, all of our other schools are considered new. Jasper Middle.
Jasper Middle.
Thank you. So 3. Okay. But still, relatively new. But we're paying more in maintenance than the state average, and likewise in administration. So part of what our school board should be looking at are areas that the superintendent has said are already off limits.